Hogwarts Legacy has a total of 5 performance modes, and one setting in particular that makes things a little more complicated. But thankfully, HDR is pretty straightforward, so let's talk about it. So let's not waste any time, I'll dive right in. Timestamps are in the description below, so you'll be able to navigate to the section that you want. And just to note, I am on the Xbox Series X, but a lot of this stuff is going to be the same on the PS5 and probably even the PC. So I want to start off by quickly going over HDR settings because it's actually really straightforward. On the Xbox Series X, PS5, and Windows, I believe, they all support the system level calibration on those consoles and the PC. So what does that mean? Well, if we go into the settings on the Xbox here, we go to TV and display options, and then we go to calibrate HDR for games. If we set this up correctly, we should have a really great HDR experience in the game from the get-go without really adjusting anything. And we'll actually confirm that. I'm using an LG C1 OLED right here. Goes up to 800 nits. So on this screen here, we just want to reduce this all the way down until we can't see it anymore. So there we go. So then on this screen, we'll actually just increase this until we can't see these blocks separate anymore. On this one, we'll do the same thing. We'll just go up until we can't see it. That should be 800 nits and we are good to go there. So now we're gonna boot up the game here and we'll go into our settings menu here. And I'm gonna go under image calibration and you'll notice HDR white point, what did I say? 800, that's what we have here. HDR black point 0, we won't touch that. HDR brightness, if you find that the game is a little too dark, this will actually adjust all the shadow details. So it defaults to 25. If the game seems to be a bit too dark, I would recommend bumping this up about 5 at a time. So go from 25 to, let's say 30. And then if that's still too dark, we can go up to 35. But I found the default of 25 to be pretty spot on. So I'm gonna return it back to there. And then the user interface brightness is just this kind of stuff, all the UI brightness elements. So you'll have a mini map, your health, all that stuff on the screen. That is going to determine how bright it is. Now I will say if you're on an OLED, I would recommend keeping this all the way down to 1, just so you don't have to worry about any type of temporary image retention or potential burn-in if you're gonna play this game for 50 hours straight or something like that. Now, if we back out, now let's talk about the performance modes. So if we do the little twirl down here, you see we have fidelity, fidelity with ray tracing, performance, balanced, and high frame rate performance or HFR performance. Fidelity, that targets 4K at 30 frames per second. I'm not sure if it's native. It may be doing some type of upscaling. The fidelity with ray tracing mode will actually require a reboot. So we're not really gonna talk too much about this. I've tested it out and honestly, the difference in visuals isn't really worth it because you are limited to only 30 frames per second, but you know, you can play around with it and pick what's right for you. Performance targets 60 frames per second and it's a upscaled 4K and it's lower resolution, but it looks okay. It looks fairly sharp. Balanced is kind of that in between of fidelity and performance and it is 40 frames per second. And then high frame rate performance targets 120 frames per second, but honestly, the image quality is so bad that I wouldn't recommend it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna dive into the game here and then we're gonna test these out. I'll show you some frame rates and what I would recommend playing. All right, so I've jumped into the game here so we can talk about performance and I can actually show you with LG's game bar thing down here on the bottom. So right now I have it on fidelity mode and it just says 118 frames per second. That's normal. The Xbox Series X is set to output 120, so it's just taking those frames and each frame it's quadrupling them, right? But there's a setting in the game called cap frame rate. And if we go in there and turn it off, watch what happens. So now in this same mode here, we are now displaying 83 frames per second. What's going on? Well, it's unlocking that frame rate basically, letting the console push out as many frames as it can. But we're not actually getting 83 frames per second. We're getting half of that because this is the low frame rate compensation or LFC, as you may have seen on some forums or other videos. And basically what it's doing is it's doubling that frame rate. And you'll see like, you know, right here, we're getting like 93, 94. We're actually getting around 45, 46 frames per second. It's just doubling those frames. And if you're used to high frame rate content, you notice as you pan around, this is not nearly as smooth as something that is actually 90 frames per second, right? So what's cool though, is if we go back in and let's drop down to the balance mode. Remember, this is the 40 frames per second mode. Turn off the cap frame rate. Now we're getting 94. Again, we're not actually getting 94, we're getting half of that. If it's 94, you know, we might be getting, 47 frames per second, and you see that it varies. But again, you're actually getting a little bit more performance than you would if you had it on fidelity with the cap frame rate turned off. So what's really cool about this is if you have a variable refresh rate display, you can actually get the maximum performance of each mode right out of the box. You're not waiting for them to update anything here. A lot of games don't do that. I really wish more games would. If we go back in, I'm gonna go down to performance now, uncap this. So remember, this is targeting 60 frames per second, but now look, we're actually getting 65. Now this is the actual frame rate. There's no doubling here. We're getting about 5, 6 frames over, 3 frames over. It's going to vary, and that's the whole thing with variable refresh rate. You will never notice this fluctuation in frame rate here. I really like having that smoothness of the 60 or just slightly above 60. And it will go up a little above that. It kind of hovers around 60 to 70 frames per second, but that's just extra performance you're getting for free, basically. And it's really, really cool that they've included this feature. Now, the last mode I will touch on is the high frame rate performance. Now, you'll see we are getting 98 frames per second. The issue comes down to the graphical quality and the resolution. All of this stuff here now, I mean, sitting really close, but all of this stuff is pretty much kind of mushy. There's no detail here. I wouldn't want to play in this mode on a larger display. Maybe a smaller display would work, but unfortunately, I just don't find it sharp enough or detailed enough to be a mode that I would want to play in. Now, my preferred mode and the one that I would recommend starting with for pretty much everyone is the performance mode. Now, if you have a standard 4K 60 Hz display, this is the perfect mode. You'll get 60 frames per second, maybe some drops here and there, not really that big of a deal. The game is actually pretty well optimized, which is a rarity this day and age. But if you have a 120 Hz display with variable refresh rate, then I would highly suggest ticking it on performance here and then turning the cap frame rate off so you get that unlocked frame rate. Now, alternatively, if you want a little better image quality, a little bit more sharpness than the performance mode offers, then you could go over to balance. That will give you a slightly sharper and more detailed image with a little bit higher frame rate than 40 or even the fidelity mode. So that would be my recommendation, is stick with performance if you want 60 frames per second, uncap that frame rate if you're on a 120 Hz display. But if you want a little bit sharper of an image and don't mind going down in frame rate a little bit, then balanced is the way to go there. As far as these other settings, motion blur, depth of field, chromatic aberration, and film grain, totally your preference. So you can turn those all off. You can keep them on, you can keep depth of field on, turn everything else off. Totally your preference. They don't affect performance at all. And the last thing I'll touch on real quick is audio configuration. Really straightforward. Home cinema, headphones, night mode, soundbar, and TV. Pick whichever device you are using. I'm using a home cinema, so that's what I'm gonna go with. Again, really straightforward. Now, unfortunately, this game does not have Dolby Atmos support, but it does upmix really well from the limited time I've been playing it. So if you have a home theater system and you have height speakers or overhead speakers, try out DTS Neural X or Dolby Surround Upmixer to add some life into those speakers above you. I actually prefer the DTS Neural X Upmixer. It actually adds a little bit more discrete sounds above you, whereas Dolby Surround just kind of adds a little bit more ambiance. Again, that's personal preference. Pick your poison there, try back and forth, and go with the one that sounds best to you. Now, like I mentioned, my preferred way to play the game is in performance mode with the frame rate cap turned off. That way I get just that little extra performance above 60. It also smooths out any dips below 60 that happen, which have been rare in my testing. Now, if you've already played the game or you're thinking of picking it up, which mode do you think you're gonna play in? Let me know down in the comment section below. Also, give this video a thumbs up, really helps me out, really helps out the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.